What if something has been watching us for thousands of years, silently cataloguing our progress, waiting for the right moment to report back? Tonight's story comes from the suggestion of Michael Elliott. Thank you for this chilling idea. If you have video ideas you'd like to see, drop them in the comments below. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories for more mysterious tales that blur the line between science and the unknown. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I kept sipping it anyway. 3:15 a.m. in northern Canada, and the only sounds were the hum of servers and the occasional crackle of static through my headphones. I'd been working as a contract technician for the Whitehorse Satellite Relay Station for 8 months now, and the isolation had become as familiar as breathing. My job wasn't glamorous. Monitor uplinks, clean signal noise, make sure commercial feeds didn't drop during the night shift when most people were asleep, and wouldn't notice if their satellite TV went dark for a few minutes. The work was methodical, almost meditative in its repetition. Check frequencies, log anomalies, file reports. Night after night, the same routine. That's why what I found that October evening stood out so starkly against the backdrop of mundane technical maintenance. Buried deep in the static of Channel 47, a frequency we used for overflow data from weather satellites, was something that shouldn't have been there. At first, I thought it was interference from the Aurora Borealis. The northern lights could play havoc with our equipment, especially during solar storm seasons. But as I isolated the signal and ran it through our standard noise reduction protocols, a pattern emerged. There was a pulse, clean, digital, repeating with mechanical precision. The delay between each pulse was exactly 13 seconds. I checked our satellite logs, cross-referencing every known orbital object that could be transmitting on that frequency. Commercial satellites, military birds, weather stations, even old Soviet hardware still tumbling through space decades after their missions ended. Nothing matched. The signal was coming from something that, according to our database, didn't exist. I printed out the frequency analysis and spectrum charts, my hands trembling slightly as the papers emerged from the laser printer. In 8 months of night shifts, I'd logged dozens of anomalies. Solar interference, atmospheric distortion, equipment malfunctions. But this was different. This was structured, intentional. As I stared at the printout, one thought kept circling through my mind. If this signal wasn't coming from any known satellite, then what was transmitting it? And more importantly, why had it taken me this long to notice something that was apparently broadcasting with the reliability of an atomic clock? I followed protocol and logged the anomaly in our incident management system. Signal source unknown, frequency 1420.4057 MHz, pulse duration 0.3 seconds, interval 13.0 seconds. I classified it as atmospheric interference and scheduled it for review by the day shift supervisor. The system immediately flagged my entry with a red warning box. Unidentified orbital source. Automatic escalation initiated. I'd never seen that message before. Within minutes, my terminal was automatically cross-referencing the signal against NORAD's satellite catalogue, then expanding to include classified military databases I didn't know our system had access to. The search results were the same across all databases. No matching orbital object found. My shift was supposed to end at 6 a.m, but I found myself staying late, compulsively checking the frequency every few minutes. The pulse was still there, still perfectly timed, still broadcasting from nowhere. When James Morrison arrived for the day shift at 7:30, I was still hunched over my workstation, surrounded by printouts and empty coffee cups. James had been working satellite communications since before I was born, a grizzled veteran who'd seen everything from Cold War spy satellites to modern GPS constellations. "You look like hell, Martinez," he said, settling into his chair with a grunt. "What kept you here so long?" I handed him the frequency analysis. Found something weird on channel 47. System flagged it as unidentified orbital source. James studied the printouts, his weathered face growing increasingly tense. After several minutes of silence, he looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Tom," he said quietly, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. You're going to delete this log entry. You're going to classify this as equipment malfunction. and you're not going to mention it to anyone else. But the signal is clean, James. This isn't equipment malfunction. Something is actually broadcasting. I said delete it. His voice carried a finality that made my stomach drop. Trust me on this one, kid. Some anomalies are better left unreported. You log something like this, and you'll invite the wrong kind of attention, the kind that ends careers. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the signal, the mechanical precision of those 13-second intervals, and I kept thinking about James's reaction, the way his face had gone pale when he saw the orbital trajectory calculations. When I returned to the station for my next shift 2 nights later, I checked channel 47 immediately. The pulse was still there, same frequency, same timing, same impossible source, but this time I didn't log it. I couldn't let it go. During my off hours, I found myself researching historical satellite anomalies, digging through declassified government documents and academic papers about space debris. Most of what I found was routine. Failed Soviet missions, American spy satellites that had gone dark during the Cold War, chunks of rockets and spacecraft that had broken apart and scattered across various orbits. But buried in a 1960 Naval Intelligence report I found through a Freedom of Information Act database, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. The document was heavily redacted, whole paragraphs blacked out with thick marker, but what remained was enough to confirm that I wasn't the first person to detect an unidentifiable signal from space. Classified, Eyes Only Naval Intelligence Division. Date, March 15th, 1960. Subject, anomalous orbital object. Ground-based radar stations have detected an object in polar orbit approximately 460 kilometers above Earth's surface. Object exhibits regular orbital characteristics, but does not match any known US or Soviet launch vehicle. Radio telescopes at Redacted have detected intermittent signals from the object. Pattern analysis suggests artificial origin. Object designation, Project Black Knight. Orbital inclination, 79 degrees, retrograde. Period, 104.5 minutes. Signal frequency, redacted. Signal pattern, redacted. Initial assessment, object, not of US or Soviet origin. Monitoring continues. Note, object appears to have been in stable orbit for redacted years prior to first detection. Analysis of historical astronomical records suggests possible earlier observations dating back to redacted. The report ended with a line that sent chills down my spine. Recommend classification level cosmic. Potential implications for national security. Require immediate suppression of public disclosure. I cross-referenced the orbital parameters with the signal I'd been tracking. The math was complex, but after accounting for decades of orbital decay and gravitational perturbation, the numbers were close enough to be significant. Project Black Knight wasn't just a Cold War curiosity. If the Naval Intelligence report was accurate, something had been in polar orbit since before humans had the technology to put anything in space. And it was still there. My research led me down increasingly dark rabbit holes. I spent hours on conspiracy forums, amateur astronomy websites, and declassified document archives. Most of what I found was obvious nonsense. Blurry photos of weather balloons, misidentified aircraft, the usual collection of hoaxes and misunderstandings that populate the fringes of the internet. But occasionally I'd stumble across something that felt different, more credible, more disturbing. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. My cousin Marcus, who worked as a data recovery specialist for NASA contractors. We'd grown up together in Ontario, and he was one of the few family members who knew about my work at the satellite station. During a family gathering in Toronto, I mentioned my research into historical space anomalies, carefully avoiding any specifics about what I'd been tracking. Marcus listened with growing interest, occasionally asking technical questions about orbital mechanics and signal analysis. "You know," he said as we walked along Lake Ontario after dinner, "I might have something that would interest you. Ever heard of the STS-88 mission?" I shook my head. Space Shuttle Endeavour, December 1998. First assembly mission for the International Space Station. NASA released hundreds of photos from that mission, including some shots of what they claimed was space debris, some kind of thermal blanket that had broken away from a previous mission. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed me one of the official NASA images, a dark, angular object tumbling slowly against the star field, clearly artificial but shapeless, like a piece of torn metal sheeting. Here's the thing, Marcus continued. I was doing data recovery on some corrupted drives from that era. NASA had a lot of storage problems in the late 90s, and I found additional images from STS-88 that never made it into the official archive. He swiped to another photo and my breath caught in my throat. Unlike the official images, this one showed the object in sharp detail. It wasn't tumbling, it wasn't shapeless, it was stationary relative to Earth, maintaining a fixed orientation with geometric precision. The object was clearly artificial, with angular surfaces and what appeared to be antenna arrays or sensor pods extending from its main body. But what made my hands start shaking was the object's orbit. Based on the Earth's curvature visible in the background and the angle of the sun, I could estimate the altitude and inclination. The numbers matched the 1960 Naval Intelligence Report exactly. Holy shit, I whispered. The file name is interesting too, Marcus said. All the official images were labelled with standard NASA mission codes, but this one had a custom name. He showed me the file properties. Instead of something like STS-088-34 2-012, the image was labelled SENTINELARCHIVE001. Marcus, I said slowly, I need you to send me everything you have on this. Everything. I can't, Tom. This stuff isn't supposed to exist. If NASA finds out I've been sharing recovered files, please. The desperation in my voice surprised even me. This is connected to something I'm working on. Something important. Marcus studied my face for a long moment, then sighed. I'll see what I can do. But you never got this from me, understand? And if anyone asks, we never had this conversation. 3 days later, a compressed file appeared in my personal email account, sent from an obviously fake address. The archive contained 17 high-resolution images of the object, taken from different angles and distances. Each photo showed the same thing, a clearly artificial construct maintaining a perfect polar orbit, its surfaces reflecting sunlight with the consistency of polished metal. But it was the last file in the archive that changed everything. Not an image, but a text document containing spectral analysis data from the shuttle's radio equipment. During the STS-88 mission, Endeavour's communications array had detected a repeating radio signal from the object. The signal was weak, barely above background noise, but the pattern was unmistakable. A pulse repeating every 13 seconds, broadcasting on a frequency of 1420.4057 MHz. The same signal I'd been tracking at the Whitehorse station. For 37 years, this thing, whatever it was, had been broadcasting the same message. I became obsessed. Sleep became optional. Food was something I consumed mechanically while staring at spreadsheets and signal analysis software. I'd converted one corner of my apartment into a makeshift research station with multiple monitors displaying frequency analysis, orbital calculations, and historical documents. The breakthrough came during a particularly frustrating all-nighter in November. I'd been trying to decode the pulse pattern using standard cryptographic methods, looking for hidden messages in the timing variations, frequency modulations, anything that might reveal meaning in what appeared to be a simple, repetitive beacon. Nothing worked. The signal was maddeningly consistent. 13 seconds between pulses, no variation in frequency, no embedded data that I could detect with any conventional analysis tools. Then I had what felt like an epiphany, or maybe just the delirium of too much caffeine and too little sleep. What if I was overthinking this? What if the message wasn't in the complexity of the signal, but in its simplicity? I opened a binary converter and began transcribing the pulse pattern as ones and zeros. Each pulse was a 1, each 13-second gap was a 0. After an hour of careful logging, I had several hundred digits of binary code. The first few conversions gave me gibberish, random numbers that meant nothing. But then I tried interpreting the binary as coordinates, using different projection systems and datum references. That's when the pattern emerged. The binary string wasn't random. It was a sequence of latitude and longitude coordinates, encoded in a base 13 numerical system. 13 seconds between pulses, base 13 encoding. The mathematical symmetry was too perfect to be coincidental. I plotted the first set of coordinates on Google Earth, 29.9792 degrees north, 31.1342 degrees east, the Great Pyramid of Giza. My hands were shaking as I decoded the next set, 51.1789 degrees north, 1.8262 degrees west. Stonehenge. The coordinates continued, each one marking a location I recognised from archaeology textbooks and ancient history documentaries. Teotihuacan in Mexico, Machu Picchu in Peru, Angkor Wat in Cambodia, Easter Island, Newgrange Island, the Nazca Lines. Dozens of ancient sites spread across every continent, connected by nothing except their age and the enduring mysteries that surrounded their construction. But it was the header data. Embedded at the beginning of the coordinate sequence was a timestamp and cycle indicator. Cycle, 13,000. Status, monitoring next. Report pending, 13,000 years. The approximate time span since the end of the last ice age, when human civilization began its rapid development from hunter-gatherer societies to the complex cultures that built the pyramids, Stonehenge, and all the other sites marked in the signal. I sat back in my chair, staring at the decoded message on my screen. The implications were staggering. If this signal was authentic, and every piece of evidence suggested it was, then something had been watching Earth for millennia, cataloguing the development of human civilization, marking the locations where our ancestors built their greatest monuments. The Black Knight satellite wasn't space junk or a secret government project. It was a sentinel, observer, a reporter, and according to the timestamp embedded in its signal, it was almost time to file its next report. The realization that something had been monitoring Earth for 13,000 years should have terrified me. Instead, I felt a strange sense of clarity, as if puzzle pieces I didn't even know existed were finally clicking into place. I spent the following weeks cross-referencing the coordinates from the signal with archaeological databases, looking for patterns in construction dates, architectural similarities, anything that might explain why these particular sites had been selected for monitoring. What I found challenged everything I thought I knew about human history. The sites weren't just ancient, they were specifically ancient in ways that suggested coordination across vast distances and time periods. The construction techniques used at Pumapunku in Bolivia showed striking similarities to methods used at Baalbek in Lebanon, despite being built by cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. The astronomical alignments at Giza matched those found at Angkor Wat, separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years, but it was the mathematical relationships that truly unsettled me. When I plotted all the coordinate points on a global map and began measuring the distances between them, I discovered that many of the sites were positioned according to precise geometric relationships. The distances formed triangles, pentagons, and complex polygons, with measurements that were exact multiples of fundamental mathematical constants. It was as if the entire planet had been surveyed by a single intelligence, with monitoring stations established according to a master plan that spanned continents and millennia. I began researching historical accounts of unexplained phenomena at these locations. What I found was a consistent pattern of reports across different cultures and time periods, describing strange lights in the sky, unusual atmospheric disturbances, and in some cases direct observations of metallic objects hovering above the ancient monuments. A medieval chronicle from Salisbury described a star that moved against the heavens, appearing above Stonehenge during the winter solstice of 1244. Mayan codices contained references to the eye that watches from the void in connection with observations at Chichen Itza. Aboriginal Dreamtime stories from Australia spoke of sky spirits that visited Uluru at regular intervals to count the changes in the world below. The accounts were separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, recorded by cultures that had no knowledge of each other's existence, but the descriptions were remarkably consistent. periodic appearances of artificial objects in the sky, always in connection with the ancient sites, always described as watching or observing rather than interacting. As December approached, I found myself checking the signal obsessively. The pulse pattern remained unchanged, but I'd begun to notice subtle variations in signal strength that seemed to correlate with the satellite's position relative to specific coordinate points. When the Black Knight passed over the Giza complex, the signal strengthened. When it crossed above Stonehenge, the pulse became more defined, cleaner. It was conducting active scans. Then, on December 21st, the winter solstice, everything changed. I was monitoring Channel 47 during my regular shift when the 13-second pulse pattern suddenly stopped. For 17 minutes, there was nothing but empty static. I thought I'd lost the signal, that decades of consistent transmission had finally come to an end. Then it returned, but different. The pulse timing had changed from 13 seconds to 12. The frequency had shifted slightly higher, and embedded in the binary stream was new data, not coordinates this time, but what appeared to be measurement readings, environmental data, population estimates. The Black Knight was no longer just monitoring, it was compiling a report. And based on the mathematical progression I was seeing in the data stream, it was preparing to transmit that report somewhere else. The signal that had been broadcasting to Earth for decades was about to be redirected outward, towards some destination in deep space. The 13,000-year observation cycle was coming to an end. Over the following days, I watched as the Black Knight's transmission pattern evolved from simple monitoring pulses to complex data streams. The binary information was now flowing almost continuously, with only brief pauses between what appeared to be different sections of the report. Using the decoding methods I'd developed, I began translating portions of the transmission. What I found was simultaneously fascinating and terrifying, a comprehensive analysis of human civilization from the perspective of something that had been watching us develop for millennia. The report contained detailed measurements of atmospheric composition changes over the past century, tracking the increase in carbon dioxide, methane and other industrial pollutants. Population growth rates were documented with mathematical precision, along with urbanization patterns and resource consumption data. But it was the sociological analysis that truly unsettled me. The transmission included assessments of human technological development, political organisation, and social structures. The language was clinical, detached, like an anthropologist studying an isolated tribe. Species, status, transitional technology, level, type 0.7, civilization population, pressure, critical environmental impact, severe aggression index, high probability, matrix, self-termination, 75% intervention, threshold, exceeded. The implications were staggering. Whatever intelligence was behind the Black Knight didn't just observe, it made judgments. It assessed civilizations and apparently had protocols for intervention when certain thresholds were crossed. And according to its analysis, humanity had crossed those thresholds. I began researching historical accounts of civilizations that had disappeared suddenly, leaving behind only their monuments and mysteries. The Anasazi of the American Southwest, who abandoned their cliff cities overnight. The builders of Great Zimbabwe, whose advanced society vanished without explanation. The Easter Island civilization, which collapsed after reaching a population peak. In each case, the disappearances occurred shortly after periods of rapid population growth, environmental degradation, and social instability. The same conditions the Black Knight was now documenting for modern human civilization. The most chilling revelation came when I decoded a section of the transmission that contained historical data comparisons. The Black Knight had been observing Earth through multiple cycles, tracking the rise and fall of intelligent species across geological time periods. We weren't the first civilization it had monitored. We weren't even the first to reach our current level of technological development. According to the data stream, there had been at least 3 previous instances of intelligence emerging on Earth, each reaching roughly our current level of advancement before disappearing from the archaeological record. The gaps in the fossil record that paleontologists struggled to explain, the mysterious extinction events that punctuated Earth's history, they weren't random catastrophes, they were interventions. As I sat in my cramped apartment surrounded by printouts and glowing monitors, the full scope of what I'd discovered began to sink in. The Black Knight wasn't just observing human civilization, it was part of a system, a galactic management protocol for monitoring and controlling the development of intelligent species. And according to its assessment, humanity's time was up. On January 3rd, everything changed again. I arrived at the White Horse Station for my regular shift to find the facility buzzing with activity. Technicians I'd never seen before were installing new equipment, and several men in dark suits were conducting interviews with the day shift personnel. James Morrison pulled me aside as I signed in. "They're from the Communication Security Establishment," he said quietly, referring to Canada's Electronic Intelligence Agency. "Someone flagged unusual signal activity from our station. They're reviewing all our logs from the past 6 months. My stomach dropped. Despite James's warnings, I'd continued monitoring the Black Knight signal, keeping detailed personal records of its evolution from simple pulses to complex data streams. If CSE investigators found evidence of what I'd been tracking... "Did you delete those anomaly reports like I told you to?" James asked. "Yes," I lied. "Classified everything as equipment malfunction." "Good. Keep it that way. Answer their questions honestly, but don't volunteer any information they don't specifically ask for." The interview was conducted by a woman named Agent Collins, who looked to be in her early 40s with the kind of sharp, analytical gaze that made me feel like she could read my thoughts. She asked about my background, my work procedures, any unusual signals or anomalies I might have detected. I stuck to James's script, denying any knowledge of unidentified transmissions, but as the interview progressed, I began to realise that Agent Collins already knew more than she was letting on. "Mr. Martinez," she said, consulting a tablet, "our analysis shows that you've been accessing frequencies outside your normal monitoring responsibilities. Specifically, Channel 47 has shown unusual activity during your shifts." "I check all channels as part of my routine maintenance," I said carefully. "Sometimes commercial satellites drift off their assigned frequencies due to hardware malfunctions. And have you detected any persistent anomalies on Channel 47? The way she emphasised the word persistent made it clear that this wasn't a fishing expedition. CSE knew about the Black Knight signal. They'd known about it long before I stumbled across it. "No," I said. "Nothing that wasn't explained by standard atmospheric interference or equipment issues." Agent Collins studied me for a long moment, then made a note on her tablet. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Martinez. We may need to speak with you again." That night I tried to access the Black Knight frequency through the station's equipment. The signal was gone. Not reduced or relocated, completely absent. After broadcasting continuously for decades, the transmission had simply stopped. I went home and checked my personal recordings of the signal, the decoded messages, all the evidence I'd accumulated over months of research. My computer had been wiped clean. Every file, every analysis, every piece of documentation had been deleted. But they'd missed one thing. Hidden in a folder of old family photos on an external drive was a single text file containing the most recent decoded transmission from the Black Knight. I'd saved it there weeks earlier as a backup, disguised with an innocuous file name. The final message was brief, formatted like a transmission header. Cycle 13,000. Complete assessment. Negative recommendation. Reset protocol authorized status. Signal terminating next contact. Cycle 13,001. 13,001. The next observation cycle wouldn't begin for another 13 millennia, but according to the transmission, there wouldn't be anything left to observe by then. The reset protocol had been authorized. In the weeks following the CSE investigation, I tried to return to normal life. I continued working my shifts at the satellite station, monitoring routine transmissions and filing standard reports. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living on borrowed time, that the countdown to something catastrophic had already begun. The signs started small. Unusual solar activity that disrupted satellite communications worldwide. Atmospheric disturbances that meteorologists couldn't explain. Reports from amateur astronomers of new objects appearing in Earth's orbital space. Objects that weren't listed in any official catalogues. Then the power grids began failing. The first blackout hit the northeastern United States in mid-February, affecting over 40 million people. Utility companies blamed equipment failures and cyber attacks, but the pattern of grid collapses suggested something more systematic. Power substations were failing in a sequence that followed major population centres, spreading outward from urban areas like ripples from a stone dropped in water. By March, the blackouts had spread across North America and into Europe. Transportation systems ground to a halt as traffic control networks failed. Communication satellites went dark. The internet, humanity's nervous system, began fragmenting as server farms lost power and fibre optic cables were mysteriously severed. I watched the collapse unfold from the relative isolation of the Whitehall station, one of the few facilities that remained operational due to its hardened infrastructure and independent power systems. But even our equipment was showing signs of stress. Signal noise was increasing daily, and we were detecting electromagnetic anomalies that our instruments couldn't properly analyse. Then I saw them during a clear night in late March. I was conducting routine maintenance on our satellite dishes when movement in the sky caught my attention. At first, I thought they were aircraft, dark shapes silhouetted against the stars, moving with the steady purpose of commercial airliners. But their flight patterns were wrong. They moved in perfect formation, accelerating and decelerating in ways that defied conventional physics. And they were completely silent, casting shadows against the aurora borealis without producing any engine noise or exhaust signatures. I counted at least 20 objects, all roughly cylindrical in shape, arranged in a geometric pattern that reminded me of the coordinate relationships I'd discovered in the Black Knight transmission. They maintained their formation for almost an hour before accelerating upward and disappearing into the night sky. The next morning brought reports of similar sightings from around the world. Military bases, government facilities, and major population centres were all experiencing flyovers by unidentified craft. But unlike traditional UFO sightings, these objects weren't hiding. They moved openly through controlled airspace, ignored attempts at radio communication, and demonstrated technology that was decades beyond anything in human arsenals. The governments of the world responded predictably. Emergency sessions of the United Nations, military mobilizations, attempts to establish communication with the unknown visitors. But it was already too late for diplomacy. The intervention had begun. The end came not with explosions or invasions, but with a systematic dismantling of the infrastructure that supported modern civilization. Over the course of 6 weeks, humanity's technological achievements simply stopped working. Power grids failed permanently, their control systems corrupted by signals that technicians couldn't trace or repair. Satellites tumbled out of orbit, their electronics fried by precisely targeted electromagnetic pulses. Transportation networks collapsed as traffic control systems, GPS networks, and communication relays went dark simultaneously. But the most devastating attack came through our information systems. Every computer network connected to the internet experienced simultaneous cascade failures. Not viruses or malware, but complete hardware corruption that rendered electronic devices inert. Decades of digital records, scientific databases, cultural archives, all of it vanished in a matter of hours. Humanity's collective memory was being systematically erased. From my position at the Whitehall station, I watched civilization crumble with the detached fascination of an anthropologist observing the collapse of an ant colony. Our isolated facility continued operating on emergency power, but we were cut off from the outside world, reduced to monitoring radio frequencies that carried increasingly desperate communications from military units, government officials, and civilian groups trying to coordinate response efforts. The pattern became clear within days. This wasn't random destruction. It was selective elimination of human technological capability while leaving the natural environment intact. Cities were losing power and communications, but forests remained untouched. Industrial facilities were shutting down, but agricultural areas showed no signs of interference. It was a reset protocol, exactly as the Black Knight transmission had indicated. Human civilization was being systematically returned to a pre-technological state, wiped clean like a computer hard drive being prepared for a fresh installation. The cylindrical craft I'd observed became a common sight, appearing over major population centres and conducting what appeared to be systematic surveys. Occasionally they would deploy smaller objects that descended into urban areas before returning to the mother ships. Witnesses described these smaller craft as conducting detailed scans of infrastructure, mapping systems, documenting the extent of human technology before methodically disabling it. No weapons were used, no violence was reported. The intervention was conducted with the clinical efficiency of pest control specialists eliminating an infestation. By April, the collapse was complete. Modern civilization had been reduced to scattered groups of survivors trying to maintain basic subsistence without electricity, motorized transportation, or electronic communication. The population centres that had housed billions of people were becoming uninhabitable as water treatment systems failed, food distribution networks collapsed, and medical facilities lost the ability to maintain life support equipment. The reset was working exactly as designed. I remained at the White Horse Station until the emergency generators finally ran out of fuel in mid-May. By then, most of my colleagues had left to find their families or join survivor communities that were forming in rural areas. The Canadian government had ceased to exist in any meaningful sense, and emergency services had collapsed along with the rest of the technological infrastructure. But I stayed, compulsively monitoring the radio frequencies for any sign that the Black Knight satellite was still active. On my final night at the station, powered by the last few hours of battery backup, I detected a weak signal on channel 47. It wasn't the familiar 13-second pulse pattern. This was a new transmission, a brief status update broadcast once every hour. Reset protocol, 97% complete population, reduction within parameters, environmental restoration, initiated monitoring, reduced schedule, status, cycle 13001 preparation, 97% complete. Humanity's technological civilization had been almost entirely eliminated, reduced to scattered pockets of survivors who would need generations to rebuild even basic industrial capability. The population that had numbered nearly 8 billion was rapidly declining as urban areas became uninhabitable and medical infrastructure ceased to function. But some would survive. The transmission indicated that complete extinction wasn't the goal, just reduction to sustainable levels and elimination of technological capability. The survivors would eventually rebuild, develop agriculture, establish new settlements. In a few thousand years they might even rediscover metallurgy and basic machines. And when they did, the Black Knight would be waiting, watching, counting down the years until the next assessment cycle. I left the station on foot, carrying only basic supplies and the handwritten notes I'd managed to preserve from my research. The roads were already becoming overgrown as nature began reclaiming the infrastructure humanity had abandoned. In the distance, I could see one of the cylindrical craft conducting what appeared to be a final survey flight, documenting the results of the reset protocol. As I walked south toward what remained of civilization, I thought about the ancient monuments scattered across the world. The pyramids, Stonehenge, Machu Picchu, all the sites that had been marked in the Black Knight's coordinate database. They were the only human constructions that had survived previous reset cycles, monuments built by civilizations that had reached technological advancement and then been systematically returned to a pre-industrial state. The stones would remain long after our cities crumbled to dust. Future archaeologists, if humanity survived long enough to develop archaeology again, would study them as mysteries, wondering how primitive societies could have constructed such precise and massive monuments. We would never suspect that those ancient civilizations hadn't been primitive at all. They had been advanced, technological societies that had been reset just as we were being reset now. The monuments weren't primitive constructions, they were survivors, the only traces of lost civilizations that had been allowed to remain as markers for future observation cycles. In 13,000 years, when humanity had once again developed satellite technology and radio telescopes, someone would detect a familiar signal broadcasting from polar orbit. A pulse pattern repeating every 13 seconds, carrying coordinates that marked the locations of mysterious ancient ruins scattered across the planet. And the cycle would begin again. I'm writing this account 15 months after the reset protocol was completed. I've joined a small farming community in what used to be called Montana, where we're slowly learning to survive without the technological conveniences that once defined human civilization. The community is growing. We've established basic agriculture, learned to preserve food without refrigeration, developed communication networks using drums and signal fires. Children are being born who will grow up never knowing what electric lights looked like, or how it felt to communicate instantly with someone on the other side of the world. In many ways, it's a peaceful existence. The sky is clearer now without the electromagnetic pollution of radio signals and satellite transmissions. The stars are brighter. During winter nights, when the aurora borealis dances across the northern horizon, I sometimes think I can see the Black Knight satellite passing overhead, a tiny point of reflected sunlight maintaining its eternal vigil. But I know this peace is temporary. Humanity is resilient, adaptable, curious. We'll rebuild. We'll rediscover metallurgy and chemistry and electronics. We'll develop radio technology and eventually satellite communications. We'll once again reach for the stars with the arrogant confidence that we're alone in the universe. And when we do, something will be waiting for us. 3 nights ago, I was awakened by a sound. The coffee cup trembles in my weathered hands as I speak these words for the first time in 53 years. My name is Detective Raymond Kowalski, retired SFPD, and I'm dying. The doctors give me 3 months, maybe 4 if I'm lucky. But luck ran out for me the day I opened that damned Alcatraz file. They said Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers drowned in the frigid waters of San Francisco Bay on June 11th, 1962. The FBI closed the case. The warden slept easy. America's most infamous prison maintained its perfect record. But I found things I was never meant to see, things that made me understand why some truths are buried deeper than bodies. This is my confession. Not of crimes I committed, but of the crime I witnessed. The systematic erasure of 3 men who may have pulled off the impossible, only to disappear into something far worse than death. If you're listening to this recording, it means I'm gone, and maybe, just maybe, the truth can finally surface from the depths where it's been drowning all these years. It was October 1968 when Lieutenant Carson dropped the manila folder on my desk like it was radioactive. 6 years had passed since the escape, and the case was supposedly closed, filed away with all the other solved mysteries that kept the bureaucrats sleeping soundly. "Formality, Kowalski," Carson said, not meeting my eyes. "Washington wants a final review of the Alcatraz evidence. Dot the I's, cross the T's, confirm what we already know. They're fish food at the bottom of the bay." I should have known something was wrong by the way he said it. Carson was a straight shooter, the kind of cop who looked you in the eye when he talked. But that day, he stared at the wall behind me like the words might crawl off it and bite him. The file was thinner than I expected for the most famous prison break in American history. Basic escape details, witness statements from guards, the makeshift raft materials found on Angel Island. Nothing I hadn't read in the newspapers. Too clean, too neat. "Why me?" I asked. Carson finally looked at me then, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Fear. Because you're thorough, maybe too thorough. They want this done right. He left me with those cryptic words and a growing certainty that this formality was anything but routine. I started with the obvious inconsistencies. The first was a car theft report from Marina District, filed 3 days after the escape. A 1959 Chevrolet, stolen from outside a boarding house. The owner, Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins, told police she saw 3 men walking away from the vehicle, heading toward the waterfront. When she called out to them, one turned and tipped his hat. "Polite as you please." "They had manners," she told the responding officer. "Real gentlemen. You don't expect that from criminals." The report was buried on page 47 of miscellaneous incident files. No follow-up, no investigation, no mention in the official Alcatraz case summary. Then there was the paddle, a crude wooden oar carved from driftwood, found by a fisherman near Richmond Bridge, 20 miles upriver from where the currents should have carried any debris. The fisherman, Miguel Santos, reported it to park rangers, who logged it as miscellaneous beach debris. No connection made to the escape, despite the timing and craftsmanship that clearly showed prison workshop techniques. But it was the witness statement that made my blood run cold. A night security guard at Fisherman's Wharf reported seeing 3 men in work clothes boarding a small fishing boat around 4 a.m. on June 12th. One of them had distinctive ears, prominent, almost pointed, just like John Anglin's mugshot description. The guard's statement was taken, filed, and apparently forgotten. When I tried to interview him, I learned he'd quit his job 2 weeks after the incident and moved back to Oregon. No forwarding address. "Don't dig too deep on this one, Ray," Carson warned me when I briefed him on my preliminary findings. "Some stones are better left unturned." That's when I knew I was onto something bigger than a prison break. The Anglin family farm in Ruskin, Florida felt like stepping into a different century. Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks, and the humid air carried the scent of orange blossoms and old secrets. Robert Anglin, the surviving brother, met me on the front porch with the wary eyes of a man who'd been expecting bad news for 6 years. "Federal agents been by here 4 times, he said without preamble, each time asking the same questions, getting the same answers. "My brother's drowned. That's what you want to hear, ain't it?" But his wife, Marie, had different ideas. After Robert went to tend the cattle, she pulled me aside in her kitchen, glancing nervously at the windows. "Christmas cards," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking grandfather clock. "Every year since '63, no return address, just signed J&C in handwriting that looks mighty familiar." She showed me a shoebox filled with holiday cards, generic drugstore variety, postmarked from different cities: San Francisco, Los Angeles, Phoenix, Mexico City. The handwriting was careful, disguised, but there were telltale loops and slants that matched samples I'd obtained from the prison records. "Why haven't you told the FBI?" I asked. Marie's laugh was bitter. "You think we haven't tried? First agent said they were hoaxes. Second one confiscated them as evidence. Third one threatened to charge us with obstruction if we kept spreading false hope. These here are copies I made before they took the originals." Photographs came out next. 3 pictures, slightly blurry, showing 2 men in work shirts standing outside what appeared to be a South American cantina. The faces were partially obscured by shadows and hat brims, but the bone structure, the posture, the way one man favoured his left leg, it all matched the Anglin brothers' physical profiles. Woman from church. Her daughter married a missionary, sent these from Brazil in '65, Marie explained. Said these 2 Americans worked construction jobs, paid cash, kept to themselves, spoke English with Florida accents. I studied the photos with a magnifying glass. The man on the left had a distinctive scar on his forearm, a scar I remembered from Clarence Anglin's prison medical records, sustained in a workshop accident at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. "FBI says they're look-alikes," Marie continued. "Coincidence, but a mother knows her son's detective. Even in shadows, even across oceans, those are my boys." The fear in her eyes wasn't the fear of grief or false hope. It was the fear of someone who knew more than she was saying, someone who'd been warned to keep quiet. As I left the farm that evening, I noticed a dark sedan parked down the country road. 2 figures visible in the front seats. When I drove past, they turned away, but not before I caught a glimpse of federal license plates. The Anglins were being watched. After 6 years, the dead men's family was still under surveillance. That night in my motel room, I spread out everything I'd gathered so far. The car theft, the paddle, the witness statements, the cards and photographs. Individually, they could be dismissed as coincidence or wishful thinking. Together, they painted a picture that made my hands shake as I wrote my preliminary report. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers hadn't drowned in San Francisco Bay. They'd made it to shore, stolen transportation, and somehow managed to disappear into the wind. The question that kept me awake until dawn wasn't whether they'd survived the escape. It was why the government was so determined to pretend they hadn't. The National Archives building in Washington, D.C. has the kind of institutional grandeur designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant. As I walked through its marble corridors in November 1968, carrying my credentials and a growing list of questions, I felt exactly as intended. The records clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the pallor of someone who spent his days in basement filing rooms, greeted my request with practiced bureaucratic indifference. Alcatraz escape files? Let me check the catalogue. He disappeared into the labyrinthine storage system, returning 20 minutes later with a puzzled frown. That's odd. The primary files show as transferred to federal custody in 1964, no longer available for review. Transferred where? Doesn't say. Just lists the authorization code. Project Paperclip Archive classified. Project Paperclip. Even a street cop from San Francisco knew that designation. The program that brought Nazi scientists to America after World War II. Why would an escape case be filed under intelligence classifications? What about the secondary files, witness statements, evidence logs? Another search, another apologetic shrug. Also transferred, same authorization. I spent 3 days in Washington, following leads that turned to smoke and asking questions that generated only nervous silence. At FBI headquarters, my request for case consultation was politely denied. At the Bureau of Prisons, I was told the relevant personnel were unavailable for comment. Even my police credentials and Lieutenant Carson's authorization letters seemed to carry no weight. It was Agent Patricia Hendricks, a bureau analyst I'd worked with on a previous case, who finally gave me the truth over drinks in a Georgetown bar. She waited until we were alone, until the other patrons had cleared out, until even the bartender was busy with inventory in the back room. "Ray, you need to drop this," she said quietly, her usual professional demeanour replaced by genuine concern. "The Alcatraz case isn't cold, it's radioactive." "What does that mean?" Patricia glanced around the empty bar before continuing. Internal memo came down in 65. Any agent pursuing Alcatraz leads beyond the official drowning conclusion would be transferred to Alaska or worse. 3 agents have been quietly reassigned since then. Good agents, career agents, all because they asked too many questions about 3 supposedly dead men. Why? If they drowned like the report says, what's the threat? Her laugh was hollow. That's the $1,000,000 question, isn't it? All I know is that certain people in very high places want Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers to stay dead, and they're willing to destroy careers to keep it that way. She slid an envelope across the table. I couldn't get you the files, but I managed to copy some of the index pages before they were sealed. Names, dates, reference numbers. Maybe you can piece together what we're not supposed to know. The documents were fragmentary, frustratingly incomplete, but they told a story that made my blood run cold. Cross-references to CIA front companies, mentions of asset recovery protocol, transfer authorization signed by officials whose names I recognized from the intelligence community. Most disturbing was a memo dated July 1962, just 1 month after the escape. Subjects may possess operational value. Recommend immediate field assessment rather than standard fugitive protocols. Operational value, not the language you'd use for bank robbers and car thieves. That night, in my Washington hotel room, I called Lieutenant Carson to report my findings. The conversation was brief and cryptic. "Ray, you need to come home. Now. I've got leads here, Lieutenant. Real leads. The leads will be there when you get back. If you get back. There are people asking questions about your questions, and those people have resources we don't. Come home." The line went dead. I packed quickly, checking the hallway twice before leaving my room. During the taxi ride to the airport, I noticed the same black sedan in my mirrors that had followed me from the archives building 3 days earlier. Back in San Francisco, Carson met me at the airport personally, something he'd never done before. His first words were a warning. "Your hotel room was searched yesterday. Professional job. Nothing taken, nothing damaged, but they wanted you to know they'd been there." As we drove through the city, he filled me in on developments from my end. Miguel Santos, the fisherman who found the paddle, died in a car accident outside Portland last week. Single vehicle collision on a straight road, clear weather, and Mrs. Hutchins, the lady who saw the car theft, moved to Phoenix, left no forwarding address. Her old neighbours say federal agents visited her the day before she left. The pattern was becoming clear. Anyone connected to evidence contradicting the official narrative was disappearing, voluntarily or otherwise. The Alcatraz case wasn't just closed, it was being actively suppressed by people with resources and authority I couldn't match. "What do I do, Lieutenant?" Carson pulled over and turned to face me. In 30 years of police work, I'd never seen him look so serious. "You write a report confirming the drowning theory. You file it properly. You forget everything you've learned, and you pray that's enough to keep you breathing." But I couldn't forget. The faces in those photographs. The fear in Mary Anglin's eyes. The systematic elimination of evidence and witnesses. Somewhere out there, the truth was buried so deep that powerful people were willing to destroy lives to keep it hidden. The question was whether I was brave enough, or stupid enough, to keep digging. Tony the Fish Marconi wasn't the kind of informant you'd find in a police procedural manual. A small-time smuggler with ties to both San Francisco's waterfront and various federal agencies that preferred not to be named, Tony survived by knowing when to talk and when to disappear. When he agreed to meet me at a dive bar in North Beach, I knew the information would be worth the risk. "You're playing with fire, detective," he said, stirring his whiskey with a nicotine-stained finger. "The Alcatraz thing? That ain't just a prison break, that's connected to some heavy government business." "What kind of business?" Tony glanced around the dim bar, noting the exits, the other patrons, the bartender's attention. Old habits from a life lived in the shadows. "You ever hear of something called the Prometheus Group?" I shook my head. "Private contractors, black budget operations, the kind of people who make problems disappear for Uncle Sam. Word on the street is they were running recruitment out of the Bay Area in the early 60s, looking for specific types, intelligent, adaptable, morally flexible, men who'd already proven they could operate outside the law." The implications hit me like a physical blow. "You're saying Morris and the Anglins were recruited?" "I'm saying Morris had an IQ of 133 and a talent for planning that impressed even the prison psychologists. The Anglin brothers were mechanical geniuses who could improvise solutions from scrap metal and determination. During the Cold War, those were valuable skills." Tony drained his whiskey and signalled for another. "Think about it. 3 men plan the perfect escape from America's most secure prison. They disappear without a trace, despite the biggest manhunt in federal history. Either they're criminal masterminds beyond anything we've seen, or they had help. Professional help. What kind of help? The kind that comes with new identities, transportation, and assignments in places where questions aren't asked. South America was crawling with intelligence operations in the 60s. Cuba, Chile, Brazil. All potential flashpoints that needed experienced operators who couldn't be traced back to Washington. The theory was insane, but it explained the evidence I'd uncovered. The systematic suppression of information, the classified file transfers, the fear I'd encountered at every level of government. If the Alcatraz escape had been a recruitment operation disguised as a prison break, then admitting the men survived would expose a covert program that violated everything America claimed to stand for. "There's another possibility," Tony continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Maybe they weren't recruited. Maybe they stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to see. Such as... Alcatraz was more than a prison detective. It was a research facility, mind control experiments, interrogation techniques, pharmaceutical trials, the kind of work that required subjects who couldn't complain to their congressman. What if Morris and the Anglins saw something during their time there? What if their escape wasn't about freedom, it was about exposure? My mind reeled with the implications. If the escapees had witnessed classified experiments, their capture wouldn't result in a return to prison. It would result in permanent silence. I've heard whispers, Tony continued. Black sites in Nevada, facilities that don't appear on any government maps, places where inconvenient people go to be forgotten, the kind of places where 3 escaped prisoners might end up if they knew too much. He finished his second whiskey and stood to leave. One more thing, Detective. You know why they call it the Prometheus Group? I shook my head. Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. The gods punished him by chaining him to a rock where eagles ate his liver for eternity. Some gifts come with a price that never stops being paid. After Tony left, I sat in that dim bar for another hour, trying to process what he'd told me. 3 theories, each more disturbing than the last. Theory 1. Cold War recruitment. The escape was facilitated by intelligence agencies looking for deniable assets. Morris and the Anglins were extracted, given new identities, and deployed to international hotspots where their criminal skills could serve national interests. Theory 2. Witness protection in reverse. The men had seen classified activities at Alcatraz and escaped to avoid being silenced. Their continued existence threatened to expose government programs that officially didn't exist. Theory 3. The darkest possibility. They were captured alive after the escape and disappeared into the black site system, spending the rest of their lives as test subjects or interrogation practice for intelligence agencies that viewed them as expendable assets. Each theory explained the evidence I'd gathered. Each theory justified the extreme measures taken to suppress the truth. And each theory meant that Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers faced something far worse than drowning in San Francisco Bay. They faced erasure from history itself. 6 months later, against direct orders from Lieutenant Carson and my own better judgment, I found myself on a flight to Rio de Janeiro. The lead had come through Tony Marconi's network, a bartender in Ipanema who claimed to remember 2 American men matching the Anglin's description, regulars at his establishment from 1971 to 1978. They paid cash, spoke little Portuguese, and never talked about their past, the bartender Carlos told me through a translator. But they were different from other expatriates, more careful, always watching the exits, never sitting with their backs to the door. The description matched surveillance training, the kind of operational security taught to intelligence assets. Carlos produced a photograph taken during a Christmas party in 1975. A grainy image showing 2 men at the edge of the celebration, their faces partially obscured but their body language unmistakably American. My hands trembled as I studied the picture. The man on the left had the same jawline, the same ears, the same way of holding his shoulders that I'd memorized from Clarence Anglin's prison files. The other figure showed signs of premature aging, stress lines and grey hair that suggested a life lived under constant tension. What happened to them? I asked. Carlos's expression darkened. They left suddenly, in the middle of the night. One day they were here, the next day their apartment was empty. The landlord said men in suits had come asking questions the week before, Americans but not tourists, government men. I spent another week in Rio following leads that grew colder with each passing day. The apartment building where the mystery Americans had lived was scheduled for demolition, its records mysteriously lost in a fire. The bank where they had allegedly maintained accounts had no record of American customers from that period. Every trail ended in convenient dead ends and missing documentation. On my final night in Brazil, I was approached by a man claiming to be a freelance journalist who'd been investigating the same story. We met at a beachside cafe in Copacabana, the sound of waves masking our conversation from potential surveillance. "You're the American detective asking about the Alcatraz escapees," he said without preamble. It wasn't a question. I neither confirmed nor denied, waiting for him to continue. "I've been working this story for 3 years," he said, following reports of American fugitives throughout South America. "The trail is real, detective, too real. These men lived here, worked here, built lives here. But every time I get close to proof, the sources disappear, witnesses relocate, documents vanish. I've had my hotel room searched, my phone tapped, my sources intimidated." He slid a manila envelope across the table. This is everything I've gathered. Photographs, witness statements, financial records, hidden in different locations for 3 years, copied and recopied to prevent loss. It's yours now. Why? Because I'm done. Yesterday, I received a visit from 2 men with American accents and no identification. They politely suggested that my investigation was endangering people I cared about. They showed me photographs of my sister's children playing in a park in Sao Paulo. Very clear photographs. Very recent photographs. The envelope contained a treasure trove of evidence. Bank records showing regular deposits to accounts held by men with obviously false Brazilian identities. Employment records from construction companies that had hired American workers without proper documentation. Hotel registries with signatures that bore striking resemblances to handwriting samples I'd obtained from Alcatraz. Most compelling was a photograph dated 1976 showing 3 men at a construction site in the Amazon basin. 2 matched the Anglin brothers' physical descriptions. The third was older, lean, with the kind of penetrating stare I remembered from Frank Morris's mugshot. All 3 wore work clothes and hard hats, looking like ordinary labourers except for their distinctly American postures and expressions. But like every other lead I'd followed, this one ended in frustration and fear. When I tried to contact the construction company, I learned it had been dissolved in 1979. The site where the photograph was taken was now underwater, flooded by a dam project that had relocated the entire local population. The pattern was always the same. Evidence of survival followed by systematic elimination of that evidence. Either I was chasing ghosts or someone with vast resources was staying one step ahead of every investigation. My flight back to San Francisco was delayed by mysterious mechanical problems. During the 6-hour layover in Mexico City, I noticed the same 2 men in different locations throughout the terminal. Always at a distance, always watching, never making direct contact. When I finally boarded the plane, they weren't among the passengers. Lieutenant Carson met me at San Francisco International with news that made my blood run cold. Federal marshals raided your apartment yesterday, Ray. Warrant signed by a judge I've never heard of, for evidence in a case they wouldn't specify. They took everything. Your files, your notes, your photographs, everything connected to Alcatraz. In the car ride home, he handed me an official-looking document. Transfer orders, effective immediately. You're being reassigned to the robbery division. Your Alcatraz investigation is officially terminated. On whose authority? Authority high enough that questioning it would end both our careers. Carson's voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. Ray, I've been a cop for 28 years. I've seen corruption, cover-ups, and conspiracies, but I've never seen anything like this. The pressure to shut you down is coming from levels of government I didn't know existed. He pulled over in a secluded area of Golden Gate Park and turned to face me directly. Whatever you found down there, whatever you think you know, it's not worth your life. These people have made careers disappear for asking the wrong questions. They can make people disappear too. As he spoke, a black sedan with government plates drove slowly past us, its occupants clearly visible through tinted windows that somehow allowed us to see their faces while hiding their expressions. The message was unmistakable. We were being watched, our conversation monitored, our future actions carefully noted. That night, alone in my ransacked apartment, I realised the full scope of what I was up against. This wasn't just a cover-up of a prison escape. It was the systematic suppression of a truth so dangerous that the most powerful government in the world was willing to destroy lives to protect it. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers hadn't just escaped from Alcatraz. They'd escaped into a shadow world where truth became enemy of the state, where survival meant accepting lies, and where the greatest prison of all was the silence that surrounded their fate. But silence, I was beginning to understand, has its own way of speaking to those willing to listen. 25 years passed like pages torn from a calendar and scattered by the wind. I worked robbery division, collected my pension, and tried to convince myself that some truths were better left buried. The Alcatraz case became a ghost that haunted my dreams, 3 faces staring at me from the depths of San Francisco Bay, asking why I'd abandoned the search for their story. Then came January 2013, and a letter that changed everything. The History Channel documentary was running old Alcatraz footage when the phone rang. It was my former partner, Jimmy Chen, now working cold cases for the FBI. His voice carried the excitement of a man who'd stumbled onto something extraordinary. "Ray, you need to see this. Someone sent a letter to the Bureau claiming to be John Anglin. Says he's dying of cancer, wants to make a deal. Information about the escape in exchange for medical treatment." My hands shook as I read the photocopied letter Jimmy brought to my house that evening. The handwriting was shaky with age and illness, but certain flourishes matched the Christmas cards Marie Anglin had shown me decades earlier. The details were specific, accurate, insider knowledge that only someone who'd lived through the escape could possess. "It's a hoax," Jimmy said, watching my reaction. "Has to be. FBI handwriting analysis says inconclusive. Could be authentic, could be someone who studied the case extensively." But I knew better. The letter wasn't just about the escape. It mentioned details that had never been made public. References to guard rotation patterns that were classified. Descriptions of cell modifications that weren't in any official report. Knowledge that could only come from someone who'd been there, who'd lived through those final months of preparation. "There's more," Jimmy continued. "The letter mentions a meeting place, coordinates in the Bay Area, where supposedly Frank Morris left something hidden before the escape. Information that was too dangerous to carry. The writer claims it's still there, waiting for someone brave enough to look." The coordinates led to a section of Angel Island State Park, near the spot where the makeshift raft materials had been found 51 years earlier. Against every instinct for self-preservation I'd developed, I found myself hiking those trails the following weekend, searching for something I couldn't name. It was hidden in a cave that didn't appear on any park maps, sealed behind rocks that looked natural but showed tool marks when examined closely. A waterproof container, military surplus from the 1960s, containing documents that made my blood run cold. Guard schedules from Alcatraz, annotated with personal notes about corruption and smuggling operations. Photographs of prison officials meeting with men in expensive suits who didn't appear in any government directories. Financial records showing payments from offshore accounts to wardens and guards who lived far beyond their official salaries. Most damning was a handwritten journal in Frank Morris's distinctive script, documenting what he'd witnessed during his time at Alcatraz. The prison wasn't just housing criminals, it was housing witnesses to government activities that violated constitutional protections. Political prisoners who'd been disappeared from the mainland. Foreign nationals being held without diplomatic notification. Test subjects for psychological experiments that would later be revealed as part of the MKUltra program. The final entry, dated 2 days before the escape, was prophetic in its certainty. We're not breaking out to be free, we're breaking out to stay alive. What we know, what we've seen, makes us more dangerous to them than any criminal they've ever housed. If we stay, we disappear quietly. If we escape and get caught, we disappear loudly. Our only chance is to vanish completely and hope the truth survives us. The documents explained everything. The official insistence on the drowning theory, the suppression of evidence, the systematic elimination of witnesses. The Alcatraz escape wasn't a crime to be solved. It was a national security incident to be contained. Morris and the Anglins hadn't just witnessed classified activities. They documented them, created a record of government crimes that could destroy careers and topple administrations. Their escape was both an act of desperation and a gamble that someday someone would be brave enough to tell their story. Reading those pages in the dim light of that hidden cave, I finally understood the true scope of the self-destruction paradox. The very actions taken to hide the truth had preserved it. The efforts to silence witnesses had created evidence. The attempts to erase history had documented it in detail. But understanding the truth and proving it were different challenges entirely. The men who'd orchestrated the cover-up were dead or retired, their crimes protected by classification systems and institutional amnesia. The witnesses were gone, scattered or silenced by 5 decades of systematic intimidation. Yet the letter kept haunting me. Someone claiming to be John Anglin, dying and desperate, reaching out across 50 years of silence to offer one final revelation. The FBI had dismissed it as a hoax, but their dismissal felt too quick, too certain, too reminiscent of the patterns I'd seen decades earlier. Late at night, when the pain in my chest reminded me of my own mortality, I wondered about the fates of 3 men who'd gambled everything on an impossible escape. Had they found freedom in the jungles of South America? Had they lived out their days under assumed names, carrying secrets too dangerous to share? Or had they been caught, disappeared into black sites where their knowledge died with them? The letter writer claimed John Anglin had survived into the 21st century, living with the weight of knowledge that could never be shared, watching as history branded him a criminal, while the real criminals wore badges and held office. If true, it was a torture more cruel than any prison cell, to know the truth and be unable to speak it, to carry justice in your heart while injustice wore your name. I kept the documents for 6 months before making my decision. They couldn't stay hidden. Too many people had died to protect these secrets, and too many others deserved to know the truth. But releasing them publicly would accomplish nothing except getting me killed and the evidence destroyed. Instead, I chose a different path. I copied everything, hid the copies in locations scattered across the country, and left instructions for their release upon my death. If the government wanted to suppress the truth, they'd have to do it posthumously, when I could no longer be intimidated or eliminated. The original documents I returned to their hiding place on Angel Island, along with my own written account of the investigation. Future generations might find them, might understand what they represented, might finally give Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers the justice they'd been denied for over half a century. But justice, I was learning, was a luxury the living could rarely afford. It was a gift we could only leave for the dead, a truth we could only speak when our own voices had been silenced. The morphine makes it difficult to focus, but I need to finish this recording while I still can. The doctors say hours now, maybe a day if I'm stubborn enough to fight the inevitable. I've been fighting for 78 years. What's one more battle against the darkness? I've spent 53 years carrying the weight of what I learned about Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. 53 years of waking up in cold sweats, wondering if today would be the day federal agents knocked on my door with a permanent solution to my inconvenient knowledge. 53 years of looking over my shoulder, checking my rearview mirror, and jumping at unexpected phone calls. The truth is a heavy burden when you're carrying it alone. I don't know if Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers lived out their days in Brazilian freedom, sipping caipirinhas on Ipanema Beach and laughing at the federal agents who'd spent decades searching for their corpses. I don't know if they died namelessly in some government facility, their final words lost in soundproof rooms designed to swallow screams. But I do know this with absolute certainty. They didn't drown in San Francisco Bay on June 11th, 1962. The evidence was always there for anyone brave enough to look past the official narrative. The car theft, the witness statements, the photographs from South America, the Christmas cards signed with familiar initials, each piece individually dismissed as coincidence or hoax, but collectively forming a picture of survival that powerful people needed to deny. The government's insistence on the drowning theory wasn't about maintaining Alcatraz's reputation or protecting prison security. It was about hiding activities that violated every principle America claimed to represent. The research programs, the intelligence operations, the systematic elimination of witnesses, all of it justified by national security classifications that turned constitutional protections into classified waste paper. Morris and the Anglins weren't just criminals who pulled off the perfect escape. They were inconvenient witnesses to state-sanctioned crimes, men whose continued existence threatened to expose a shadow government that operated beyond law, beyond oversight, beyond accountability. Their escape became their crime, their knowledge became their death sentence, their survival became a national security threat that required decades of cover-ups, intimidation, and murder to contain. I've left evidence of everything I'd discovered, hidden in multiple locations protected by legal arrangements that will trigger automatic release upon my death. Some truths are too important to die with the men who discover them. The morphine is winning now, and the room is getting darker. But before I fade away, I want to leave you with this final thought. Alcatraz was never escape-proof because its walls were too high or its waters too cold. It was escape-proof because the government made survival more dangerous than imprisonment, freedom more terrifying than captivity. The greatest prison isn't built with stone and steel. It's built with silence and fear, with official denials and convenient accidents, with careers destroyed and witnesses disappeared. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers didn't die in San Francisco Bay. The Bay didn't kill them. The silence did. And silence. Silence is the strongest prison of all. But even silence eventually comes to an end. Recording ends with the sound of steady breathing that gradually grows fainter, until only the mechanical hum of hospital equipment remains. Found among Detective Raymond Kowalski's personal effects, along with detailed instructions for the release of sealed documents and recordings. To whoever finds this recording and follows the trail I've left behind, my name was Detective Raymond Kowalski, badge number 2847, San Francisco Police Department. I died on December 20th, 2021, at 3:17 a.m., alone except for the ghosts of 3 men whose story I spent a lifetime trying to tell. If you're reading this, it means the legal mechanisms I put in place have been triggered. Safety deposit boxes in 7 different states will have been opened. Law offices in 4 different cities will have released sealed documents. Digital files stored in multiple secure locations will have been automatically transmitted to journalists, historians, and government oversight committees. I've spent 53 years preparing for this moment, the moment when my voice could finally break the silence that has protected one of the greatest cover-ups in American history. The documents you now have access to represent only a fraction of what was hidden. For every piece of evidence I managed to preserve, dozens more were destroyed by people who understood that truth was their greatest enemy. But what remains is enough. Enough to prove that Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers survived their escape from Alcatraz. Enough to demonstrate the systematic suppression of evidence by multiple government agencies. Enough to show that the official narrative was a carefully constructed lie designed to protect state secrets more valuable than human lives. I need you to understand something. The men who orchestrated this cover-up weren't comic book villains twirling their mustaches in shadowy rooms. They were patriots in their own minds. They believed that protecting classified operations was more important than acknowledging 3 escaped prisoners. They convinced themselves that national security justified any level of deception, any amount of witness intimidation, any degree of evidence suppression. They were wrong. In a democracy, truth cannot be classified indefinitely. Justice cannot be postponed forever. The families of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers deserve to know their fates. The American people deserve to know what their government did in their name. History deserved an accurate record, not a convenient fiction. I've carried this burden alone because I was afraid. Afraid of losing my pension, my reputation, my life. Afraid of being dismissed as a conspiracy theorist or a disgruntled cop. Afraid that speaking the truth would accomplish nothing except getting me killed. But fear, I've learned, is just another form of prison. And like Alcatraz itself, it's only escape-proof, as long as you believe the walls are stronger than your determination to break free. To the families of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, your loved ones were not the criminals history has made them out to be. They were witnesses to government crimes who paid the ultimate price for their knowledge. Whether they found freedom in South America or died in government custody, they deserved better than 50 years of official denial and systematic character assassination. To the government officials who will undoubtedly attempt to discredit these revelations, your time is over. The men who created this cover-up are dead. The operations they were protecting have been declassified or exposed through other channels. The only thing your continued denials accomplish is further damage to public trust in institutions that have already lost too much credibility. To the historians and journalists who will investigate these claims, be careful, be thorough, be brave. The people who killed witnesses and destroyed evidence may be gone, but the systems they created to protect state secrets remain in place. Truth-telling is still a dangerous profession in America. To Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin, wherever your final resting places may be, your story is finally being told. Your truth is finally being spoken. Your silence is finally being broken. You escaped from Alcatraz on June 11th, 1962. You survived the waters of San Francisco Bay. You lived beyond that night, whatever your ultimate fates may have been. History will remember you not as the criminals who failed to escape, but as the men who succeeded too well for the government's comfort. Your greatest escape wasn't from prison, it was from the official narrative that tried to erase you from history. That escape, at least, was permanent. Final statement for the record. I, Detective Raymond Kowalski, being of sound mind and facing imminent death, do hereby swear under oath that every statement in this recording and its accompanying documents represents the truth as I discovered it through my official investigation into the Alcatraz escape of 1962. I have knowingly risked my career, my safety and my life to preserve this information. I have done so not for personal gain or professional advancement, but because I believe that in a democracy, truth belongs to the people, not to the bureaucrats who find it inconvenient. If my death occurs under suspicious circumstances, if these documents are somehow suppressed or discredited, if this recording mysteriously disappears, let it stand as evidence that the cover-up I've documented continues to claim lives. But if this message reaches you intact, if the truth I've preserved finally sees daylight, then maybe, just maybe, the strongest prison of all has finally been breached. The silence is broken, the truth is free, and Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers can finally rest in peace, knowing their story has been told. Badge 2847, signing off for the final time. A massive thank you to Vortex9119 for this incredible video suggestion. If you have story ideas you'd like to see brought to life, drop them in the comments below. And if you're enjoying these immersive tales, don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories for more stories that blur the line between mystery and reality. What if I told you that buried beneath a 1,000-year-old chapel in Ethiopia lies something so powerful that governments have spent decades ensuring you never learn about it? What if every conflict, every war, every uprising in that region wasn't random chaos, but a response to something ancient awakening? My name is Alex Morrison, and 3 months ago, I was just another satellite imaging technician, analysing ground-penetrating radar for a living. Now I'm hiding in a cabin in rural Montana, and I may be the only person alive who knows the truth about what's really buried in Axum. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I kept sipping it anyway. That's what you do when you're 3 weeks behind on satellite analysis reports, and your supervisor keeps sending those passive-aggressive emails with red exclamation points. I was a field technician for Orbital Dynamics, a mid-tier satellite imaging company that contracted with everyone from agricultural firms to mining corporations. My job was simple: analyse ground-penetrating radar scans, identify subsurface anomalies and file reports. Nothing glamorous, nothing dangerous, just data. The Horn of Africa cluster had been sitting on my desk for 2 days. Standard geological survey for a potential infrastructure project in Ethiopia. Roads, power lines, the usual development stuff that required knowing what lay beneath the surface. I'd already processed 47 grids of unremarkable sediment layers and bedrock formations when I opened grid 48. The image loaded pixel by pixel, revealing the familiar topography of northern Ethiopia. Rolling hills, scattered vegetation, and the ancient town of Axum with its towering obelisks and stone churches. But there, beneath the church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, was something that made my breath catch in my throat. A perfect geometric void. Not a cave, not a natural formation. The radar signature showed clean, straight edges forming a rectangular shape, approximately 4 feet long, 2.5 feet wide, and 2.5 feet deep. The dimensions were so precise they could have been cut with industrial equipment, yet the surrounding rock layers indicated this void had existed for centuries, possibly millennia. I pulled up the analysis protocols on my second monitor. Standard procedure for unexplained anomalies was clear. Mark as geological inconsistency or data corruption, and move on. The company didn't pay us to solve mysteries, just to identify potential construction hazards. But those dimensions nagged at me. 4 feet by 2.5 feet by 2.5 feet. I'd heard those measurements before, in some half-remembered history class or documentary. Something biblical. I saved the image to my personal drive before marking the official report as data corruption. Recommend resurvey. My supervisor would approve it without a second glance, and the client would order new scans of the area that would somehow never quite capture that same perfect void again. As I prepared to move on to the next grid, I noticed something else in the metadata. The thermal overlay showed heat signatures throughout the scan area, solar absorption on the surface, geothermal activity deeper down, all normal patterns, except for the void. The void was 3 degrees warmer than the surrounding rock despite being completely enclosed. Dead objects don't generate heat. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned, but no amount of analysis could explain what I was looking at. Finally, I closed the file and went home, but the image followed me. Those perfect dimensions, that impossible heat signature, the way it sat directly beneath one of Christianity's most sacred sites. 4 feet by 2.5 feet by 2.5 feet. The traditional dimensions of the Ark of the Covenant. That night, I dreamed of golden cherubim with wings spread wide, and a voice that spoke from between them with the sound of rushing water. In the dream, I was standing in a stone chamber, lit by a light that cast no shadows, reaching toward a box that hummed with power. The moment my fingers touched the gold, I woke with a gasp, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was just a dream, I told myself. Just my imagination running wild after a long day staring at radar scans. But when I checked my phone, I found I'd been unconsciously searching for information about Axum, about the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, about ancient artifacts hidden beneath holy ground. The next morning I couldn't focus on anything else. I pulled up the scan again, studying every pixel, every thermal gradient, every impossible detail of that buried void. This wasn't data corruption. This was something real, something significant, something that had been deliberately hidden from the world. Something that was waiting. 3 weeks later, I was on a plane to Ethiopia. I'd convinced my supervisor that the Axum anomaly required ground truthing, a field verification to ensure our radar systems were functioning correctly. The company approved the trip because it sounded technical and responsible, not because I'd spent every spare moment researching the legend of the Ark's journey from Jerusalem to Ethiopia. According to tradition, the Queen of Sheba took the Ark back to Ethiopia after her visit to King Solomon. Her son, Menelik I, founded the Ethiopian Empire and established Axum as its capital. For 3,000 years, Ethiopian Orthodox Christians had claimed the true Ark of the Covenant rested in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, guarded by a single monk who could never leave the sacred precinct. Tourist nonsense, I'd always assumed. Every culture claimed to have some piece of biblical history hidden in their backyard. But now I had radar evidence of something buried exactly where the legend said it would be. Something that matched the Ark's traditional dimensions and somehow generated heat despite being entombed in solid rock. I landed in Addis Ababa on a Tuesday morning and caught a domestic flight to Axum the same day. The town was smaller than I'd expected, a collection of low buildings scattered around the famous obelisk park and the twin churches that claim to house the world's greatest religious relic. Tourists wandered between the ancient stone monuments, taking selfies with 3,000-year-old carved pillars, while guides recited well-practiced speeches about Queen Sheba and King Solomon. I hired a local guide named Dawit, a middle-aged man with intelligent eyes and careful English who specialised in the historical sites. We spent the first day touring the obelisk park and the ruins of ancient palaces, but I was really just getting a feel for the area, trying to match the topography to my radar scans. "Tomorrow we visit the churches," Dowett said as we walked back to my hotel. "The old church and the new church. Very sacred places." "Can tourists go inside both churches?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "The new church, yes. Beautiful paintings, ancient books, many treasures. But the old church..." He paused, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "The old church is different. Only priests allowed inside, and the guardian." "The guardian?" "One monk, chosen for life. He watches over the..." Dowett lowered his voice. "Over what is kept there. He can never leave the church grounds. Never. He stays until he dies, then another is chosen." We'd reached my hotel, but I wasn't ready to end the conversation. "What exactly is he guarding?" Dowett looked uncomfortable. "Christians say it is the Tablet, the Ark of Moses. Others say it is just tradition, just stories. But I have lived in Axum all my life, and I tell you this, the guardian is real. I have seen him walking in the church courtyard at night, always alone, always watching." "What does he look like?" "Old, but not in years. Old in ... Dowett struggled for the word. "Old in soul. Like a man who has seen too much, carries too much weight. His eyes..." He shuddered. "I do not like to look at his eyes." That night I lay in bed studying satellite photos of the church complex on my laptop. The Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion was actually two buildings. A newer church built in the 1960s where tourists and worshippers could visit, and a smaller, older chapel that supposedly housed the Ark. The older building sat directly above the void I detected in the radar scan. According to everything I'd read, no outsider had been permitted inside the chapel in centuries. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintained absolute secrecy about what was housed there, allowing only the guardian and select high-ranking clergy to enter. Even the country's government respected the restriction, treating the chapel as sovereign territory beyond their jurisdiction. But tomorrow, I'd at least be able to see the building from the outside, maybe get close enough to take some thermal readings with the handheld scanner I'd brought. It wasn't much, but it might help me understand what was generating that heat signature 12 feet below ground. The next morning, Dowett led me through Axum's narrow streets toward the church complex. We passed market stalls selling coffee and spices, elderly women spinning cotton on wooden wheels, children playing soccer with a ball made of rags. Normal life in a normal town that happened to claim possession of humanity's most powerful religious artifact. The Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion compound was surrounded by a high stone wall with an ornate gate. Beyond the entrance I could see the modern church with its painted dome and arched windows, and behind that, partially hidden by trees, the smaller chapel that supposedly housed the Ark. "We can tour the new church," DeWitt explained as we approached the gate. "Beautiful interior, many ancient paintings and manuscripts, but the chapel behind it..." He pointed to the smaller building. "That is forbidden." We passed through the gate into a courtyard filled with pilgrims and tourists. The modern church was indeed impressive, with colourful frescoes covering every wall and elaborate religious artefacts displayed in glass cases. But I found myself constantly glancing toward the windows that faced the restricted chapel, trying to catch a glimpse of the building that sat above my mysterious void. After an hour of dutifully admiring religious art, I excused myself to use the restroom, then slipped outside into the courtyard. The restricted chapel was maybe 50 yards away, separated from the public area by a low fence and some carefully placed shrubs. I walked casually in that direction, pulling out my phone as if taking pictures of the church architecture. The chapel was older than the main building, constructed from rough stone blocks that had been weathered smooth by centuries of highland rain. Small, narrow windows pierced the walls at regular intervals, but they were too high and too dark to see inside. The building's footprint was roughly 30 feet by 40 feet, large enough to house a small congregation, or to contain something that required a significant amount of protective space. As I was trying to estimate the building's exact position relative to my radar scan, a figure appeared in one of the windows. The guardian. Even from 50 yards away, I could see that Dowett hadn't exaggerated. The man's face was gaunt to the point of being skeletal, his skin pale as parchment despite Ethiopia's intense sun. But it was his eyes that made my breath catch, dark, hollow, ancient in a way that had nothing to do with age, eyes that had seen something no human should see, carried some weight that was slowly crushing the life out of him. For a long moment we stared at each other across the courtyard. Then the Guardian raised one thin hand and made a clear gesture. Go away. Not a casual dismissal, but an urgent warning, the kind of motion you'd make to stop someone from stepping into traffic. As I watched, his lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. You don't want what's inside. Then he disappeared from the window, leaving me standing in the courtyard with my heart hammering and my thermal scanner forgotten in my pocket. The Guardian hadn't just been warning me away from the chapel. He'd been warning me away from whatever was buried beneath it, whatever was generating that impossible heat signature 12 feet underground. Whatever had been slowly killing him with its proximity for however many years he'd been trapped in that building. I found Dowett waiting by the main church entrance, looking concerned. You saw him, he said. It wasn't a question. Yeah. Then you understand why I do not like to look at his eyes. Come, we should go. There are other sights to see, happier places. But as we left the church compound, I couldn't stop thinking about that desperate gesture, that silent warning. The Guardian knew something was down there, something that had been affecting him for years, possibly decades, something that pulsed with heat and waited in the darkness beneath ancient stone. That night I called my supervisor and extended my stay in Ethiopia by a week. Back in my hotel room, I spread out printed satellite photos across the bed and fired up my laptop. The thermal scanner I'd brought was designed for surface readings, useless for penetrating 12 feet of stone and earth, but I had access to something better. Orbital Dynamics' complete archive of satellite data for the region. If the object beneath the chapel was generating heat, that heat had to go somewhere. And if I was right about what was down there, the heat generation might not be constant. I started with our company's historical scans of Axum, going back 15 years to when we first began regular coverage of the Horn of Africa. The early images showed the same thermal patterns I'd seen in the recent scan. Solar absorption, geothermal activity, normal ground temperatures, but the void beneath the chapel was already 3 degrees warmer than its surroundings, even in the oldest images. 15 years of continuous heat generation. Whatever was down there wasn't running on batteries. I pulled up the metadata for each scan, looking for variations in the thermal signature over time. For the first few years, the readings were remarkably consistent. 3 degrees above ambient, no significant fluctuation. Then, starting in 2010, the pattern began to change. Small spikes at first, maybe half a degree increases that lasted for a few days before returning to baseline. But as I worked forward through the data, the spikes became more frequent and more intense. By 2018, I was seeing heat surges of 6 to 8 degrees above normal, sometimes lasting for weeks. The most recent scan, the one that had started this whole investigation, showed the highest readings yet. Nearly 12 degrees above the surrounding rock temperature, sustained over the 3-day period when the satellite had passed over the region. I sat back, staring at the data visualization on my screen. The heat signature wasn't just evidence that something was buried beneath the chapel. It was evidence that something was becoming more active, more powerful, more awake. But what could cause those kinds of fluctuations? I needed to correlate the thermal spikes with external events, see if there was a pattern I was missing. I opened a new browser window and started searching for news archives covering Ethiopia and the surrounding region. Wars, natural disasters, political upheavals, anything that might correspond to the dates when the thermal readings spiked. The first major heat spike had occurred in September 2010. I cross-referenced the date and found coverage of renewed fighting in South Sudan, just a few hundred miles from Axum. Border clashes, civilian casualties, the usual litany of African conflict. The heat signature had jumped to 6 degrees above normal and stayed there for 2 weeks. December 2014, another spike, this one lasting almost a month. I found reports of protests in Ethiopia's Oromia region that had turned violent, with government forces killing dozens of demonstrators. The thermal readings had peaked at 8 degrees above normal. March 2019, the biggest spike yet, nearly 10 degrees above ambient temperature. Major fighting had erupted between Ethiopia and Eritrea along their shared border, the worst violence in years between the two countries. Thousands of troops mobilised, artillery exchanges, threats of full-scale war. The pattern was undeniable. Every time conflict erupted in the region, the object beneath the chapel became more active. Not just reactive, but almost anticipatory. Some of the thermal spikes had begun days or even weeks before the first news reports of violence. I leaned back in the hotel room's uncomfortable chair, trying to process what the data was telling me. If the Ark of the Covenant was really buried beneath that chapel, and if it was somehow responding to regional conflicts, what did that mean? According to biblical accounts, the Ark had been a weapon used by the Israelites to destroy their enemies and part the Jordan River. But those were just stories, weren't they? Ancient myths to explain natural phenomena or military victories. Except now I had 15 years of satellite data suggesting those stories might have been more literal than anyone imagined. I opened a new search window and typed in Ark of the Covenant Biblical Powers. The results were a mixture of scholarly articles, religious websites, and conspiracy theories, but certain themes appeared consistently. The Ark as a communication device between God and Moses. The Ark as a weapon capable of destroying armies. The Ark as a source of divine power that killed anyone who touched it improperly. One academic paper caught my attention. Electromagnetic Anomalies in Biblical Texts, a technical analysis of the Ark narrative. The author, a physicist from MIT, had attempted to explain the Ark's described effects in terms of advanced technology rather than divine intervention. According to his analysis, the biblical descriptions were consistent with some kind of high-energy, electromagnetic device, possibly using principles that modern science was only beginning to understand. The paper was 8 years old and had been largely ignored by mainstream academia, but its conclusions were fascinating. If the Ark contained technology rather than divine presence, technology based on electromagnetic manipulation of space-time, then its effects on local conflicts might be measurable, predictable, even controllable. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight, but I wasn't tired. I had 15 years of data to analyse, patterns to uncover, connections to make. If I was right about what was happening, the implications went far beyond archaeological discovery. This was about a weapon that had been influencing regional conflicts for decades, maybe centuries, sitting 12 feet beneath a chapel in northern Ethiopia. A weapon that was becoming more active. I pulled up the most recent thermal readings again, studying the heat signature that had triggered this entire investigation. 12 degrees above ambient temperature, the highest reading yet. And according to the news feeds I'd been monitoring, tensions were rising again along the Ethiopia-Eritrea border. Troop movements, diplomatic protests, the same warning signs that had preceded every previous spike in the thermal data. If the pattern held, the heat signature beneath the chapel would spike again within days, and somewhere in the Horn of Africa, people would start dying. I saved all my analysis to an encrypted drive and uploaded backup copies to 3 different cloud storage services. Whatever was happening in Axum, I was probably the only person outside the Ethiopian Orthodox Church who understood the connection between the buried object and regional violence. The only person who could prove that the Ark of the Covenant wasn't just a religious relic, but an active weapon that had been shaping the history of East Africa for 3 millennia. The only person who might be able to stop it. I had a contact at the Vatican Archives, someone I'd met at a conference on satellite archaeology 3 years earlier. Elena Rossi was a researcher specialising in the historical verification of biblical sites, and she had access to documents that most scholars could only dream of seeing. If anyone could tell me what the Catholic Church knew about the Ethiopian claims regarding the Ark, it would be her. I drafted a carefully worded email describing my satellite findings in technical terms, without mentioning my theories about the thermal correlations with regional conflicts. I presented it as an archaeological question. Had the Vatican ever investigated the Ethiopian Orthodox claims about possessing the Ark of the Covenant? Elena's response came within 6 hours, which surprised me. Her replies usually took days, given the bureaucratic nature of Vatican communications. Alex, your inquiry has been noted and forwarded to the appropriate department. However, I must inform you that materials related to your specific request are currently under protocol relic restrictions. I cannot provide further information at this time. I would advise against pursuing this research direction. E. Rossi, Protocol Relic. I'd never heard the term before, and a quick internet search turned up nothing. No academic papers, no government documents, no casual references in religious forums. It was as if the phrase existed in a completely separate information ecosystem, one that normal researchers couldn't access. That afternoon, my hotel room phone rang. The caller ID showed only international with no number. Mr. Morrison. The voice was American, middle-aged, with the kind of neutral accent that comes from years of diplomatic training. Yes, my name is Cardinal Michael Toretti, Vatican Secretariat of State. I understand you've been making inquiries about certain historical artifacts currently held by our Ethiopian Orthodox colleagues. A cardinal calling me directly. In 31 years of life, I'd never been important enough to warrant attention from anyone higher than a district manager, and now I had a Vatican cardinal on the line. I'm a satellite imaging technician, I said carefully. I analyse ground-penetrating radar for geological surveys. Yes, we're aware of your professional background. We're also aware of your recent travel to Axum and your communication with Dr. Rossi. Mr. Morrison, I'm calling to advise you that you've stumbled into an area of inquiry that falls under Vatican security protocols. For your own safety, I strongly recommend that you discontinue this research and return to the United States immediately. My own safety? There are historical artifacts that were never meant to be disturbed, Mr. Morrison. Some knowledge carries a price that few are prepared to pay. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has maintained certain guardianship responsibilities for nearly 3 millennia. That arrangement exists for the protection of all concerned parties. I could feel my heart racing, but I tried to keep my voice steady. What is Protocol Relic? There was a long pause. You're not cleared for that information, nor do you want to be. Take my advice, Mr. Morrison. Book the next flight home and forget whatever you think you've discovered in Axum. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. The line went dead. I sat in my hotel room for a long time after that call, staring at the phone and trying to process what had just happened. A cardinal in the Vatican Secretariat of State, essentially the Catholic Church's Secretary of State, had called me personally to warn me away from my research. Not a local church official, not even a regional administrator, but someone at the very highest levels of Vatican hierarchy. Which meant the Catholic Church not only knew about the Ethiopian claims regarding the Ark, they were actively monitoring anyone who showed too much interest in investigating those claims. They had files on researchers, protocols for managing inquiries, and enough influence to track down a satellite technician in an Ethiopian hotel within hours of his asking the wrong questions. I thought about the Guardian's hollow eyes and his desperate warning, "You don't want what's inside." Maybe he wasn't just protecting the Ark from the world. Maybe he was protecting the world from the Ark. My laptop chimed with a new email notification. The sender was listed as E. Rossi, but the message was clearly not from Elena. Mr. Morrison, this will be my final communication on this matter. Protocol Relic is a Vatican security classification established in 1962 following certain discoveries made during the Second Vatican Council's review of sealed archives. Materials under this classification are restricted to a maximum of 12 individuals worldwide, all of whom hold positions equivalent to cardinal or higher within the Catholic hierarchy. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has maintained custody of the artifact in question under a formal agreement dating to 1965. This agreement recognises Ethiopian sovereignty over the artifact in exchange for adherence to specific containment protocols established by a joint Vatican-Ethiopian commission. These protocols exist because the artifact exhibits properties that pose significant risks to regional stability when improperly handled or exposed. The Guardian tradition is not merely ceremonial, It serves a crucial containment function that has prevented numerous potential catastrophes over the past several decades. Your thermal analysis data has been reviewed by our technical staff. We are aware of the correlations you have identified. We are also aware of the artifact's increasing activity levels over the past 5 years. A joint Vatican-Ethiopian assessment team is currently evaluating options for enhanced containment measures. This communication will self-delete in 60 seconds. Do not attempt to copy or save this message. Return to the United States immediately and discontinue all research related to this matter. You have been warned twice. There will not be a third warning. I watched the message count down from 60 seconds, trying to memorize every word. When it reached 0, the email disappeared from my inbox as if it had never existed. But I'd learned what I needed to know. The Vatican knew about the thermal correlations with regional conflicts. They'd known for years, possibly decades. And they were worried enough about increasing activity levels to consider enhanced containment measures. The Ark of the Covenant was real, it was buried beneath the chapel in Axum, and it was becoming more dangerous. I needed to get that thermal data to someone who could do something about it. Someone outside the Vatican's sphere of influence. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I opened my laptop and began typing up a detailed summary of everything I'd discovered. The satellite data, the thermal correlations with regional conflicts, the Vatican security protocols, the Guardian's warning. If something happened to me, I wanted there to be a record of what I'd found. Outside my hotel window, the ancient obelisks of Axum stood silhouetted against the Ethiopian night sky. Monuments to a civilization that had claimed to possess God's greatest gift to humanity. 12 feet below, a simple stone chapel. Something waited in the darkness, growing stronger, growing more active, preparing for something that would make the regional conflicts of the past 15 years look like minor skirmishes. And I was probably the only person outside the Vatican and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church who understood what was coming. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of booking a flight home like the Vatican had demanded, I drove the rental car to a cybercafe in Addis Ababa and uploaded a carefully edited version of my satellite data to Reddit. I chose the r/conspiracy subreddit because I knew it would get attention without being taken seriously by any official monitoring systems. The post was titled, "Weird Thermal Anomaly Under Ethiopian Church. Anyone know what this could be?" I included 3 of the clearer thermal images showing the heat signature beneath the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, along with GPS coordinates and a brief description of the geometric void. I deliberately left out any mention of the Ark, the Vatican communications, or the correlations with regional conflicts. To casual readers, it would look like a curious geological anomaly discovered by a satellite technician who was genuinely puzzled by what he'd found. The post got 17 comments in the first hour. Most were jokes about ancient aliens or government cover-ups, but a few showed genuine technical interest. One user with apparent geology credentials suggested underground geothermal activity. Another pointed out that the heat signature was too localized and too geometric to be natural. I was reading through the comments when my laptop screen went black. Not a normal shutdown or crash, but an instantaneous cut-off as if someone had yanked the power cord. Except the laptop was running on battery power and the charging light was still on. The screen stayed black for maybe 10 seconds, then flickered back to life showing the Windows startup sequence. When the system finished rebooting, my Reddit post was gone. Not deleted with a moderator message, not removed for violating community guidelines, but completely absent as if it had never existed. My browser history showed no record of visiting Reddit. The thermal images I'd uploaded weren't in my recent files folder. Someone had remotely accessed my laptop and scrubbed all evidence of the post, while leaving everything else untouched. I sat in the internet cafe for a long time, watching Ethiopian families use the other computers to video chat with relatives abroad and university students researching papers. Normal people living normal lives, oblivious to the fact that I'd just learned something terrifying about the reach and capabilities of whoever was monitoring research into the Axum artifact. They had hacked my laptop remotely, selectively deleted specific files, and removed all trace of my Reddit post within hours of its publication. This wasn't just Vatican influence or church pressure. This was signals intelligence, cyber warfare capabilities, the kind of resources that only major governments or international intelligence agencies could deploy. I paid for my computer time and walked back to the rental car, feeling like I was being watched even though the street looked perfectly normal. Addis Ababa traffic flowed around me with its usual chaotic energy. Buses packed with passengers, merchants pushing handcarts loaded with goods, children selling bottled water at red lights. But someone in that crowd could be monitoring me. Someone with access to satellite feeds and facial recognition software, and the authority to scrub information from major social media platforms in real time. That night, back in my hotel room in Axum, I made backup copies of all my remaining data and hid them in 3 different locations around the town. One encrypted drive taped under a restaurant table where I'd eaten dinner, another hidden in the base of an ancient obelisk in the archaeological park, the third buried in a plastic bag near a tree outside the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, as close to the chapel as I could get without being seen. If they could hack my devices remotely, I needed analog backups they couldn't access digitally. The next morning I woke to find my hotel room door unlocked. I always used the deadbolt and chain lock, habits from years of business travel. But both were disengaged, and there was no sign of forced entry. My luggage had been searched with professional thoroughness. Everything returned to almost exactly its original position, but with tiny variations that proved someone had been through my belongings. My laptop was still there, apparently untouched. My cameras and field equipment were undisturbed, but the encrypted drive where I'd stored copies of the satellite data was missing from the hidden compartment in my suitcase. They'd taken only what they needed and left everything else to maintain the illusion that nothing had happened. Except they'd made one mistake. They'd unlocked the door when they left, probably to avoid the sound of manipulating the locks from inside. I was no longer just being monitored, I was being actively managed. I packed quickly and checked out of the hotel, telling the desk clerk I had a family emergency back in the United States. But instead of heading to the airport, I drove to the archaeological park and retrieved the data drive I'd hidden at the base of the obelisk. Sitting in the rental car with ancient stone monuments all around me, I made one final attempt to get the information out. I logged into an anonymous email account I'd created years earlier and composed a message to every major news organisation I could think of: CNN, BBC, Reuters, AP, the New York Times. The subject line was simple: evidence of active electromagnetic anomaly at claimed Ark of Covenant site in Ethiopia. In the body of the message I laid out everything: the satellite thermal data, the correlations with regional conflicts, the Vatican's protocol relic warnings, the cyber intrusion and hotel room search. I attached the clearest thermal images and GPS coordinates, along with a detailed timeline showing how the heat signature had intensified over 15 years. I hit send and watched the message appear in my outbox, then immediately start moving to the sent folder. Except it never arrived. I tried again with a different email service, then a third. Same result every time. The messages showed as sent from my end, but never reached their destinations. Someone was intercepting my communications at the internet service provider level, identifying and blocking any transmission that contained my satellite data or references to the Axum thermal anomaly. I was completely isolated, cut off from any normal channels of communication, surrounded by an electronic net that prevented me from sharing what I'd discovered. But I still had the physical drive hidden near the church, and I still had one option they couldn't control remotely. That afternoon, I walked to the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion compound and found a spot where I could observe the restricted chapel from a distance. Tourists and pilgrims moved through the public areas, taking photos and buying souvenirs, while the Guardian's building sat silent and forbidden behind its fence. I waited until late afternoon, when the crowds thinned and the light was beginning to fade. Then I walked casually toward the area where I'd buried the encrypted drive, as if I were just another tourist admiring the ancient architecture. The drive was gone. The plastic bag was still there, exactly where I'd buried it, but empty. They'd found my backup, extracted the data, and left the bag as a message. We know where you've been. We know what you've hidden. We can reach anything you think is secure. As I stood there staring at the empty bag, a shadow fell across the ground beside me. I looked up to see the Guardian standing at one of the chapel windows, his hollow eyes fixed on my face. But this time, he wasn't warning me away. He was nodding, almost imperceptibly, as if he approved of what I'd been trying to do. Then he pointed downward, toward the ground beneath my feet, and mouthed a single word I could read clearly even at 50 yards distance. Soon! I flew back to the United States the next day, but I never made it to my apartment in Denver. 2 men in dark suits were waiting for me at baggage claim, holding a sign with my name and looking like the kind of federal agents you see in movies. "Mr. Morrison, we're with the Department of Homeland Security. We need to speak with you about your recent travel activities." They escorted me to a windowless room in the airport security section, where a third man was waiting with a thick folder and a digital recorder. "I'm Agent Phillips," the older man said. "We understand you've been conducting unauthorized intelligence gathering in Ethiopia, specifically related to sites of religious significance to our Ethiopian government partners. I'm a satellite imaging technician. I analyze geological data for mining and construction companies. We're aware of your professional background, Mr. Morrison. We're also aware that you've been making inquiries about classified materials with Vatican contacts, posting sensitive imagery to social media platforms, and attempting to contact media organizations with what you claim is evidence of electromagnetic anomalies at Ethiopian Orthodox Church sites. They knew everything. Not just my activities in Ethiopia, but my attempts to share the data, my communications with Elena Rossi, even my failed Reddit post. The thermal imagery you captured falls under the jurisdiction of several international agreements regarding the protection of cultural and religious sites," Phillips continued. "Specifically, it relates to a joint Vatican-Ethiopian cultural preservation protocol that supersedes normal academic or journalistic access. Cultural preservation protocol? The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has requested that certain sites be protected from unauthorized analysis or exposure that might damage their religious significance or cultural integrity. The Vatican has agreed to help enforce these protections as part of ongoing interfaith cooperation initiatives. It was a lie, of course. They weren't protecting cultural sites. They were suppressing evidence of something that posed a much more serious threat. But I was sitting in a windowless room at the Denver airport with 3 federal agents, and my laptop had already demonstrated that normal channels of communication were compromised. "We're prepared to offer you a choice, Mr. Morrison," Phillips said. "You can sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding your recent research activities, accept reassignment to a different geographical focus area within your company, and continue your career with no further complications. Or we can discuss this matter with your employer, your security clearance sponsors, and potentially with federal prosecutors, who take a very dim view of unauthorized intelligence activities in sensitive foreign locations." I stared at the folder on the table between us, thinking about the Guardian's hollow eyes and his final gesture toward the ground beneath the chapel. Thinking about 15 years of thermal data showing an ancient weapon growing stronger, more active, more dangerous. What happens if I sign? You return to your normal work assignments. You avoid any further research related to Ethiopian archaeological sites. You don't discuss your recent findings with colleagues, media contacts, or internet forums. In exchange, we ensure that your employer receives a positive assessment of your professionalism and discretion during this culturally sensitive assignment. And if I don't sign? Phillips opened the folder and showed me the first page. It was a letter from Orbital Dynamics' Human Resources Department, dated that morning, informing me that my employment had been terminated due to misuse of company resources for unauthorized personal research projects. "Your security clearance will be revoked," he continued. "Your access to government contracting databases will be permanently blocked, and we'll be sharing our assessment of your activities with other satellite imaging companies, geological survey firms, and any future employers who request background information." They were offering to destroy my career or let me pretend none of this had ever happened, but either way, the information I'd gathered would never reach anyone who could act on it. I thought about Cardinal Toretti's warning on the phone. Some knowledge carries a price that few are prepared to pay. Maybe this was the price. Professional destruction, isolation, the slow erasure of everything I'd worked to build over the past decade. I need time to think about it. You have until we finish processing your luggage, 20 minutes, maybe 30. 20 minutes to decide whether to sacrifice my career for information that no one would believe, no one could verify, and no one was allowed to investigate. I signed the non-disclosure agreement. They released me 2 hours later with a stern warning about the consequences of violating federal agreements and a business card with a phone number I could call if I ever felt tempted to discuss my Ethiopian research with anyone. But they made one crucial mistake. They assumed I was the only person who had access to the satellite data. That night in my apartment in Denver, I opened my laptop and logged into Orbital Dynamics employee portal. My access had been suspended, as expected, but the system showed I was still listed as being on authorized leave for another 3 days. Someone had delayed updating my termination in the central database. I used those 3 days to access everything I could reach. Not just my own analysis files, but the complete archive of satellite coverage for the Horn of Africa going back to the company's founding. If the thermal anomaly beneath the Axum Chapel was increasing in intensity, there might be other sites showing similar patterns, other locations where ancient artifacts were responding to modern conflicts. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. The Ark wasn't unique, it was part of a network. Thermal anomalies appeared at 17 different locations across the Middle East and North Africa, all buried beneath religious sites, all generating heat signatures that correlated with regional violence. A geometric void beneath the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. Another under the Great Mosque of Mecca. Heat sources beneath Christian monasteries in Syria, Coptic churches in Egypt, ancient temples in Iraq. Every major conflict of the past 2 decades, the Iraq War, the Syrian Civil War, the Arab Spring, the ongoing violence in Yemen and Libya, correlated with intensified thermal activity at multiple sites. As if the artifacts were communicating with each other, coordinating their responses to human warfare. I copied everything I could access onto encrypted drives and mailed them to safety deposit boxes in 3 different states. Then I submitted my resignation from Orbital Dynamics, citing personal reasons, and disappeared. For 3 weeks I lived in cheap motels and paid for everything with cash, moving from city to city while I tried to figure out what to do with what I'd learned. The thermal network wasn't just evidence of ancient technology, it was evidence of an active weapons system that had been influencing human conflict for millennia. A weapons system that was becoming more coordinated, more responsive, more powerful. On a Tuesday morning in Salt Lake City, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Elena Rossi. "Alex, thank God. I've been trying to reach you for weeks." "Elena, I thought you were under Vatican restrictions." "I'm calling from a secure line. Listen carefully. Something has happened. The Ethiopian government has sealed off the entire Axum region. No flights in or out, no ground access, complete media blackout. They're claiming it's a military exercise, but my sources inside the Ethiopian Orthodox Church say it's something else." "What kind of something else?" "The Guardian is dead, Alex. He died 3 days ago. And when they went to choose his replacement, they found the chapel empty. Whatever was buried beneath the church, it's gone." I felt the blood drain from my face. Gone how? No one knows. The Ethiopian military is conducting a grid search of the entire region, but there's no sign of forced entry, no evidence of excavation, no indication that anyone broke into the chapel. The artifact simply left. That's impossible. Satellite thermal imaging shows massive energy spikes at 17 locations across the Middle East and North Africa, all occurring within a 6-hour window starting with the Guardian's death. The Vatican has activated something called the Omega Protocol, and they're requesting immediate assistance from the United States, Russia and China. The Omega Protocol. I'd never heard the term before, but I could guess what it meant. The final contingency, the last resort when all other containment measures had failed. "Eleanor, where are you calling from?" "I'm at a monastery in Switzerland. The Vatican has evacuated all protocol relic personnel to secure locations. They're expecting the worst." "What's the worst?" "According to the sealed archives, the last time the artifacts were fully active was during the Crusades. The entire geopolitical structure of 3 continents collapsed within a century. Empires fell, entire populations migrated, technological development stalled for 500 years. I thought about the thermal data I'd collected, the correlations between artifact activity and regional violence. If the Ark and its companion devices were no longer contained, no longer isolated in buried chambers beneath ancient churches, what would happen to the world? Alex, are you still there? Yeah. Eleanor, I need you to do something. I'm going to send you coordinates for safety deposit boxes in Phoenix, Dallas, and Atlanta. Inside each box is a complete archive of satellite data showing the thermal network. If something happens to me, make sure that information reaches someone who can act on it. What are you going to do? I'm going to find the Ark. The line went dead. That afternoon I bought a plane ticket to Ethiopia under a false name, using identity documents I'd acquired during my weeks of hiding. If the Ethiopian government had sealed off the Axum region, I'd have to find another way in, but I was probably the only person outside government and religious authorities who understood the scope of what was happening. The only person who might be able to track down a 3,000-year-old weapon that had just escaped from its prison and was preparing to reshape human civilization. I'm writing this from a cabin in the mountains of western Montana, 6 months after the Axum incident. The official story is that a localized seismic event damaged several ancient structures in northern Ethiopia, requiring temporary military restrictions while archaeological assessment teams evaluate the cultural heritage impact. The real story is that 17 ancient weapons have vanished from their containment sites across 3 continents, leaving behind nothing but empty chambers and the withered corpses of their guardians. The thermal network I discovered through satellite analysis was just the visible symptom of something much older and more complex. For 3 millennia, objects of immense power had been sleeping beneath humanity's most sacred sites, occasionally stirring in response to nearby conflicts, but generally remaining dormant under the watch of religious orders that had forgotten why they were really guarding empty rooms. Now they're awake, active and loose in a world with 7 billion people, and enough weapons to destroy civilization a dozen times over. Elena kept her promise and distributed copies of my satellite archive to researchers at major universities, intelligence agencies, and international organizations. Most dismissed the data as elaborate hoax or misinterpreted sensor readings. A few took it seriously enough to begin their own investigations, only to discover that every relevant database had been scrubbed, every supporting document had vanished, every potential witness had signed binding non-disclosure agreements. But I know the truth is spreading, filtering through the kind of networks that governments can't completely control. Academic conferences where researchers share suspicions in private conversations. Intelligence analysts who notice patterns their superiors don't want them to report. Military officers who track unexplained energy signatures and find their requests for investigation quietly denied. The world is changing, and most people don't realize it yet. Regional conflicts that should burn out quickly are intensifying instead. Ancient ethnic tensions are flaring into violence across Africa and the Middle East. Political movements that seemed stable are fracturing along religious lines. The artifacts aren't causing the conflicts. Humans are perfectly capable of finding reasons to fight each other, but they're amplifying existing tensions, feeding on the emotional energy of warfare and using that power to grow stronger, more coordinated, more influential. I've been tracking their movements through news reports, social media posts, and amateur satellite imagery, shared on forums that haven't been scrubbed yet. Heat signatures appearing in conflict zones days before major battles. Unexplained electromagnetic anomalies detected near military bases. Reports of ancient artifacts being discovered by various armed groups, then quickly disappearing again. They're not random. They're following a pattern, positioning themselves to influence key events, preparing for something bigger than individual regional conflicts. Last week I received an encrypted message through a routing system so complex I couldn't trace its origin. The text was simple. The covenant was not meant for one people or one place. It was meant for all people, all places when the time was ready. The time is now ready. Choose wisely. Choose wisely, as if I have a choice in whatever's coming. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the real power of these artifacts isn't their ability to influence events, but their ability to force people to make choices they wouldn't otherwise have to make. The Guardian at Axum spent decades watching over something that was slowly killing him, but he chose to stay, chose to maintain the containment protocols, chose to warn me away from dangers I didn't understand. Now it's my turn to choose. I could destroy this account, burn the remaining evidence, disappear completely into a life where none of this ever happened. Or I can keep tracking the artifacts, documenting their movements, building a record of what's really happening as the world stumbles towards some kind of transformation it doesn't see coming. The cabin where I'm staying sits on 40 acres of isolated mountain forest, far from cities and conflict zones, and the electromagnetic networks that seem to attract the artifact's attention. But even here, on clear nights, I can see strange lights moving across the sky. Not aircraft, not satellites, but something else entirely, following patterns that suggest intelligence and purpose. They're out there, 17 pieces of ancient technology that were designed to reshape civilizations, and they're working together now, coordinating their efforts, preparing for something that will make the fall of empires look like minor historical footnotes. I have 3 more encrypted drives hidden in various locations around the country, each containing copies of everything I've learned about the thermal network and the artifact sites. If you're reading this, it means something happened to me, and Elena Rossi or one of the other researchers I contacted managed to get this information published despite whatever security measures are in place to prevent it. Don't dismiss this as conspiracy theory or elaborate fiction. Check the satellite data yourself if you have access. Look for thermal anomalies beneath major religious sites. Track the correlations between unexplained energy signatures and regional conflicts. Pay attention to news reports of ancient artifacts being discovered and then quickly classified or removed by authorities. The pattern is there if you know how to look for it. The Ark of the Covenant was never lost. It was never just sitting passively in some forgotten chamber, waiting to be discovered by archaeologists or treasure hunters. It was sleeping, along with its companion devices, under the protection of guardians who understood that some powers are too dangerous for humanity to wield. Now it's awake, and it's not alone, and it's preparing to fulfill whatever purpose it was originally designed for 3,000 years ago. The only question is whether we'll be ready for what comes next. I hope this account reaches people who can do something with the information, people with resources and influence, and the courage to investigate what most would rather ignore. But even if it doesn't, even if this becomes just another conspiracy theory lost in the noise of the internet, at least there will be a record of what one satellite technician discovered when he looked too closely at the wrong thermal signature. The Ark Protocol is active, the Covenant has been renewed, and somewhere in the darkness between the ancient and the modern, 17 pieces of divine technology are preparing to reshape the world according to plans that were set in motion before human civilization began. Choose wisely. Alex Morrison, December 2024.